All right. Hi. This is a special episode of Made of Robots, where we're going to be talking about why the Turing Test matters. This is in response to all the media craze over the last week over Eugene passing the Turing Test, and I want to talk about that and address some of the criticisms and give a defense of Turing that explains why he matters and why the test matters for understanding artificial intelligence today. So a couple of things just before we get going. I have a little slideshow that I want to share. Let me find my thing. I probably should have said all this up before we started, but screw professionalism.
Yeah, in fact, I said that.
Yeah. So I shared the slideshow, the link to the slideshow, and the link to the hangout in the chat thread for the event. So if anyone wants to join the hangout and wants to come on live and talk with us and ask questions, that would be great. Some people are doing that. That's wonderful. How perfect.
There's somebody.
Yeah. I also made a slideshow for this, so I'm going to go ahead and throw the slideshow up on the screen just so we have some idea of what I'm doing. It often will sound like I'm just winging it, because I am, but I've thought about this stuff, so I did some work. How do I make this full screen?
Yeah, that's it. Lock it down to your screen now, so it doesn't flip around.
Oh, yeah. There it goes. And then I want to make this full screen.
Go.
Full screen. Sweet. All right. So here's the plan. I want to start by talking about how the Turing Test works. And I want to do that in sort of two ways. One, I want to give the standard textbook interpretation of the Turing Test that you get in any Philosophy 101 course or Introduction to Artificial Intelligence or whatever. So I want to give the standard interpretation, and then I want to give my own sort of eccentric interpretation, and I'll give some justification for my interpretation. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some modern experimental psychology work that supports this interpretation, I think, rather strongly. And I think on this interactionist interpretation, a lot of the discussion of Turing and the test in the media recently is sort of off the mark, and I'm hoping to correct some of that by providing this interpretation. So once I go through my own telling of Turing, I want to go back to Eugene and give a discussion of sort of what happened in that publicity stunt and what value it has and what we should think about it. And then after that, I want to address the backlash in the media. So I want to do two things, address two specific criticisms. One was Kurzweil's not yet objection that this doesn't meet the Turing test, but sometime before his predicted date of 2025, I believe, a machine will pass the Turing test. So the claim here is that Eugene doesn't quite cut it. And then another criticism in the media, an even stronger criticism, and this one directed at Turing himself, comes from Massimo, who argues that the Turing test doesn't matter. I'm sort of cribbing the title of this hangout from his recent essay. He says the Turing test doesn't matter and that we should abandon it. He says that Turing test doesn't tell us what we want to know, and so even if you have some machine passing the test, it's not going to count as an intelligent machine in the way that we care about. So Pilucci says we should abandon the Turing test. He compares Turing to Ptolemy at one point, and I want to sort of talk about things there. And then I have some more general things to say about the role of these sort of publicity stunt kind of events in science and the sort of public discourse around science. So that's my plan for the discussion. See if I can get it back to me. So that's my plan for the discussion. So I have a plan, so if I'm rambling, I can keep on track. Feel free if anyone is in the chat.
Remains to be seen.
Yeah. If anyone in the chat has any questions or wants to interrupt me, just start talking, and I will be happy to entertain and follow tangents as they arise. How does that sound, John? Does that sound okay?
Yep, that sounds good. Hit it.
All right, so let me go back to the slideshow then. So we're going to go ahead and start with the standard interpretation of the Turing test. So the standard interpretation, this is an image from the Wikipedia page on the Turing test. Is this, you're following along? Yeah. Okay, so this is a Wikipedia page on the Turing test. The idea here is about judging the machine's intelligent behavior in terms of whether or not it's distinguishable from a human. That's going to be part of my interpretation also, but this is the sort of standard line. And there's this nice little image here of the test setup. So there's a computer on one hand, there's a person on the other, and they both pretend to be a person to a judge. And the judge is blocked from seeing the machine that's doing the talking, and it's only able to interact with the text itself, and not any other behavioral indications. So the idea here is that if the machine can fool the judge into thinking that it's human, if the machine can convince the judge that it speaks like a human being, then the machine passes the test. Anything that passes the test we should consider intelligent. This is the idea that Turing's view is just that passing this test counts as intelligent. So what we want is to build machines that can pass this test, and then we will have intelligent machines. We'll have artificial intelligence, and that's the criteria. So all the discussion, as far as I can tell in the media around the Eugene event, has taken this sort of standard interpretation, and some of the question is whether or not it's, well, first of all, the question is, has Eugene passed the test by this interpretation? And then second of all, is the test actually the right sort of test we want to judge whether a machine is intelligent? Okay. I think that's clear. I don't know if I should say anything else.
I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that those are two really relevantly different questions. And like those are things that have been conflated a little bit, I think, in a lot of the popular write-ups. That whether or not the thing, whether this particular chatbot, Eugene, has passed by the standard interpretation, and whether or not the standard interpretation is a good way to measure intelligence. A lot of people have been sliding back and forth between that in ways that are really particularly problematic, I think. And I think that's something we're probably going to come back to, but doing a good introduction is probably the right thing to do.
Right. Okay.
That's the only thing I wanted to say.
Yeah. So we're going to come back to Eugene, so maybe I'll just leave this here. So this is the standard interpretation of the test. If the machine can fool a human being into thinking that it's talking with another human being, then it's an intelligent machine.
Or a certain collection of human beings. There's a sort of probabilistic thing, right? It has to fool a certain number of people.
Yeah, and a certain percentage of the time. So Turing says explicitly in the original test
right.
that the criteria here is that no more than 70% of the judges are fooled after 5 minutes of questioning. So the idea is that the test is supposed to be a very short, brief sort of snippet of conversation, and even if a majority of the human beings can distinguish the computer from another human being, if at least some of the human beings are fooled, then it counts as passing the test. So 30%. It's a very low bar to meet. So even on the standard interpretation, I think it's recognized that Turing's bar here is very low. The machine doesn't need to do very much. It just needs to act like a human being. Importantly here, Turing isn't requiring anything more about the computer's mental life. So Turing doesn't require that the machine is conscious, or that it's made of organic material, or that it has a brain or some neural structure. It doesn't require that it's doing anything other than what a digital computer does. On Turing's view, you can make a digital computer, you can build a digital computer that can perform sufficiently varied tasks to behaviorally convince another human being that it's engaging in a conversation.
I mean, and in fact, the vagueness that's implicit in a bunch of those other problems or in a bunch of those other definitions is part of what motivated him to come up with this test, right? So like questions about like whether or not the computer is conscious or whether or not it can think whether or not it can do anything that's intelligent in any kind of general sense, is really, really hard to operationalize or to answer in any kind of rigorous way. So this test is supposed to be a response to that. It's something that can actually give you a concrete measure for whether or not something is able to meet a particular definition of intelligence.
That's right, and this is why Massimo rejects the Turing test. He calls it a behaviorist test, and that's part of what's going on here, is that there's no deeper criteria for these things except what we can observe in an empirical setting. And you're exactly right. Turing's motivation here is the same kind of motivation as the rest of the behaviorists, which is to rid science of this mysterious talk of minds and only work with the things that we can empirically observe. So on Turing's view, what you can observe here is the actual conversational dialogue, and if that dialogue passes the muster, passes the judgment of another human interlocutor, then that counts as intelligence. I was trying to refrain from saying too much about Turing's motivation here because my interpretation of Turing's motivation is so wrapped up with my own interpretation of the test that I didn't want to bias it too much. But I think that's a fair.
This is the standard interpretation, though, right? I mean, this is what people like when you get this in like a introductory philosophy of mind class or a introductory computer science class where you're talking about artificial intelligence. This is the kind of thing that people are going to talk about.
Right.
That it was a behaviorist interpretation. I mean, even people who are professional philosophers tend to think this, I think, unless they've spent a lot of time working on this issue.
Yeah. And have eccentric views about it. So the important. Yeah, the important part here about the standard interpretation is that the upshot is that Turing has a specific view of what counts as a mind or what counts as intelligent, and what counts as intelligent is passing this behaviorist criteria, convincing a judge. So Turing's view of a mind just is whatever can successfully do that convincing. And there's lots of reasons to be concerned with Turing's test on this grounds. There's lots of things that you might think are important to minds that aren't represented in the test, you don't see in the test. And there's lots of criticisms along these lines in philosophy. But I'm not going to go through those criticisms. What I want to do is instead motivate a different interpretation of the test. And this interpretation of the test is motivated by the idea that Turing himself doesn't want to give a criteria of what counts, doesn't want to give some standard of what counts as a mind. He's not interested in defining the mind. In fact, in the paper he says that the question, can machines think, is too meaningless to deserve discussion. That line has been interpreted in lots of different ways. The way I interpret it is that Turing isn't interested in giving a definition of what is or isn't a mind. Instead, he's interested in the cases where human beings are gripped to treat the machine as if it were another mind. Not that that counts as some kind of genuine intelligence, but rather that that's what human social intelligence consists in this kind of participatory interaction. So this is why I call this the interactionist approach, or the interactionist interpretation. Oops, I didn't want to show myself. I wanted to change the slide.
That's going to take some motivation. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of sliding there between any kind of like intuitive view of what's going on here and the kind of view that you're going to be promulgating here. So, I mean, maybe this is just a good segue to start talking about why an argument for why you think this is the right way to think about this, because, I mean, nothing that comes up in Turing's approach has anything to do with interaction or socialization or anything like that, at least on the face of it.
Yeah, so the particular source in Turing that I'm drawing from is a discussion that's not in the artificial intelligence paper, but it's actually in some of his mathematical writing. Let me show myself for this. So Turing talks at one point about fair play for machines, and I think the discussion of fair play does bring in this kind of interactionist social dynamic. So his discussion of fair play arises in the context of the demands that we put on the machine. So in particular, he's worried about whether or not machines can make mistakes.
And whether or not the goals that we set for machines are reasonable, given the goals that we set for other kinds of cognitive agents, right? I mean, the idea is that the kinds of criteria that we should hold potential candidates for artificial intelligence to the things that they should satisfy in order for us to count them as legitimate parts of our community or as legitimate intelligent agents shouldn't be radically different from the kinds of things that we need other sorts of agents to satisfy. The things that we generally take to be. So, like, if I hold you and a machine to wildly different kinds of criteria, then it seems like I've already stacked the deck one way or the other, right?
Right. So Turing here is thinking about mathematical proof. So a computer doing a math problem, and then the computer makes a mistake, and he's worried that people are going to jump out at that mistake and say, the machine made the mistake, it didn't correct that mistake, obviously it's not intelligent, it's not actually thinking through the problem. And Turing says, well, but look, we don't hold human mathematicians to that same standard. Human mathematicians can make mistakes all the time, they can correct those mistakes, and we don't think them any less intelligent for it, especially when they correct their mistakes. But we hold the machine, it seems, to this higher standard where we demand perfection from the machine, that it always performs correctly. This kind of conversation, by the way, comes up in places other than math proofs. There's a discussion right now about these autonomous cars and whether or not, if they hit a kid or something, what happens. This is another case where it seems like we're demanding our machines to perform perfectly, to never make a mistake. In fact, human drivers make these kinds of mistakes all the time, and we kill thousands of people a year. That's something that we've all just accepted. Yeah, more than that. It's something we've all just accepted as a matter of fact. But if it's a robot driver, then the standards are suddenly much, much higher. And if the machine makes a single mistake and kills a single person, then everyone's going to be outraged. So Turing says, look, this isn't fair. It's not fair in the sense that the same standards of judgment aren't being applied across the board. If we're going to judge this fairly, we should include fair play for machines and judge the machines by the same standards. So we shouldn't hold the machine to impossibly high standards. If we're going to judge its intelligence relative to a human being, we should judge the machine by those same standards. So this is what I think motivates the test. It's this desire for fair play. So the way that I think the reasoning of the test works is as follows. We typically think that anything that can talk using language, and even for people who have radically strong views about how the mind works, they typically think that language use is this paradigmatic, intelligent activity of human beings. Descartes thought this, for instance. Descartes thought that human beings uniquely had minds, and the evidence of this was the fact that we used language. So lots of people think that language use is an indicator of intelligence. So let's just say that that's the indicator, and then a machine will be judged intelligent if a human being engaging in a conversation with that machine can't distinguish it from the other things. The idea here is that this is a fair play standard. This is the same way we would judge the intelligence of any other human being, by engaging them in a conversation and seeing that they're able to intelligently respond. If this is the standard that we hold human beings to, then we should also hold machines to that standard. Everything else about the test for Turing is designed to mask the other prejudices that we have about machines. So you're not allowed to see what the machine does because we might be prejudiced, we might be biased against silicon and wires. It's not organic. It doesn't look like a human being, and so we might not think it intelligent. Even if it's doing really intelligent things, we might take the visual appearance to undermine that judgment. And same thing for lots of other reasons. Turing, in general, thinks that we have this strong bias against the machine that's part of what explains these higher standards for the machine. And so the Turing test is designed, it concedes that intelligence might be a good criteria for, conversational language use might be a good criteria for intelligence, and then tries to mask away all the other properties so we can just focus on that property and see if the machine passes. So the idea here is that if you can engage the machine in a conversation that both sides are sort of sustaining as an active conversation that you would have with any other human being, and after that conversation is over, the person doesn't have any judgment, any indication that it was a computer, and then we should consider that computer as intelligent as any other thing that we consider intelligent. if that's the criteria that we're using to judge intelligence, then that criteria should be applied across the board. So just to emphasize how this is different from the standard interpretation, the standard interpretation claims that Turing has a substantive view of what intelligence is. Intelligence is acting like a human being. And then the Turing test is interpreted under the standard interpretation as just seeing whether or not the computer meets that standard. On the interactionist interpretation here, the issue isn't does the machine meet the standard of intelligence, but rather does the machine sustain the kind of activity that we would expect from other intelligent machines by the standards that we judge those other machines. So it's not that there's some particular standard that we're holding the machine to, but rather we're seeing if it performs at the same standard that we hold all other intelligent machines to. Does that make sense?
All other intelligence to, right?
Yeah,
in a particular context. I mean, so it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it's a machine. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Like, we shouldn't be concerned with whether or not it's a machine. It's what we're judging to be an intelligence in a particular context is based on whether or not the system that we're interacting with is able to produce the right kinds of inputs and outputs in the situation that we're finding ourselves in. So it shouldn't have anything to do with machines at all. That's part of the fair play point.
Right. Good. Good.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, I'm on my thing.
There we go.
So
that's the standard interpretation, right? Everything that we've said so far.
No. Wait.
Well, where's the divergence then?
Where's the difference?
Yeah, the divergence between the kind of account that you're putting forward here and the standard interpretation.
Right. The divergence is that on the standard interpretation, Turing has a positive view of what the mind is, and on the interactionist interpretation, Turing doesn't have any view of what the mind is. All that Turing has is the criteria for recognizing a mind. Right. So the issue here is about recognition. So, the legacy of the Turing test, the impact that it's had on science and especially psychology is in Dennett's sort of intentional stance theory of mind stuff. The idea here is that what it is to have a mind is to be recognized as an agent of a particular kind by agents that take the intentional stance. So the idea here is that having a mind is an interpretation that people take of a certain kind of behavior, that the behavior fits a kind of pattern, an intentional pattern. And the issue here isn't whether that pattern is real or genuinely in the thing, but rather whether it triggers the recognition of that pattern in pattern detectors. So this is what's called a theory of mind. A theory of mind is a pattern detector that some agents have for detecting other agents. The issue in the Turing test is whether or not the computer can sufficiently trigger our agent detecting devices, our mind detecting devices. The issue isn't what genuinely counts as a mind. The issue is instead what counts as triggering our mind recognizing detectors.
Or what can be neatly slipped into our practices, right, where it matters whether or not something has a mind, where what traditionally we would think of as the kind of component that needs to be integrated into these practices is something that has to have a mind. If something is able to satisfy all of those relational criteria, then that's just all it is. There's nothing over and above that, right? I mean, it's like the worry that I have is that the way you're framing this still is really sympathetic to either the kind of behaviorism that people are usually worried about, the kind of people that we've been talking to online are worried about, or that there's just some sort of like relativist thing about whatever we think has a mind, And I think this kind of idea that you're putting forward here wants to walk a really careful line between those two things, right? It's not a relativist thing, and it's not a behaviorist thing either. It has to do with fitting into a particular kind of interaction and predictive framework, and that's Dennett's thing. It's not just the social, but the being able to predict what things are going to do over time.
That's right. So in order to walk that line, I want to talk about this particular experimental paradigm in psychology. It's called the perceptual crossing paradigm. I've been talking about it a lot this last week because I think it demonstrates how Turing's test is actually relevant for the way we understand the mind today. So the image on the left here is the perceptual crossing paradigm. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. No, that's wrong. That's not how you do that.
I'm still just seeing the interactionist thing.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's the image on the... There. Can you see that? No? Is the image not very clear? Let me pull up the... is that better? Not really.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, here. I just want to make sure you can see all the
yeah, there you go. Just talk about it. There you go. Just scan down to the bottom of that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is a perceptual crossing paradigm. The perceptual it's an experimental paradigm from 2009. Auvry. I don't know how to say the name. Right. Auvry 2009. And it's an experimental paradigm designed to test the recognition of agency. In fact, this particular experimental paradigm grew out of considerations on the extended mind and whether or not mental activity can take place outside of one's sort of brain and cognitive system. And so the way that this experiment works is that there's a virtual line that these people live on. So there's two players in this game. Player 1 and player 2, they each have the same equipment. In their right hands, they have a little trackball, and the trackball can move left and right. And what they're doing is they're controlling a avatar on a virtual line. So when they move the trackball left and right, they move their little avatar left and right on this virtual line. And imagine that the line loops around, so when you hit the edge, you pop out on the other side, sort of like Pac-Man. So you're moving this trackball left and right, and you're sort of wandering around this line. And you're interacting with other objects on the line. So first of all, there's static objects on the line, these two red lines right here. These static objects don't move, and every time you cross them, you get a little stimulus, and that's what's in their left hand. There's a little vibrating pad, sort of like in your phone. And they feel the vibrating pad every time they cross something. Their avatar crosses something on the line. So every time they cross the static object, their vibrating pad vibrates. They can also cross each other because they're both interacting on the same virtual line. So every time they cross each other, their pad vibrates. And just to make things a little more complicated, there's also these shadow objects that trail the avatar by a fixed amount. And it's short enough that the user will never cross their own shadow object. So in effect, the user can only encounter 3 other objects, the 2 static objects. I'm sorry, can only encounter 4 other objects, the 2 static objects, the other user's actual avatar, and the other user's shadow object. So the test here, what is being tested in this experiment is whether or not the players can correctly identify when they've interacted with the other agent. In other words, can agents identify each other even in this very limited domain? Notice that every time they cross any object, they're getting the same stimulus. They're just getting this little vibration. So there's nothing in the stimulus itself that indicates what the difference is. The only difference has to be in the pattern of stimulation that the user encounters. And in fact, that's what you see. You see users engaging these objects differently. It engages the static object differently than it engages the user in the shadow object. And the result of this is that the users can accurately identify the other agents in the system with a very high degree of accuracy. There's a number that I should have on the top of my head. I think it was upwards of 70%. There's a very high degree of accuracy. I can't find the figure. I'll link to the...
I imagine it would go up the longer they had to interact with it, too.
That's right. In fact, what you see is that users start to develop a kind of a signal communication...
strategy, right?
A strategy, that's right. And the strategy is actually really interesting, and it's probably pretty intuitive also. The strategy is oscillation. So what's going on is that when you interact with the static object just sits there. So the way that users do the detection is that, so here's the user up on top, and when the user moves past the static object, what it does is it moves past, and then it feels something, and then it moves back and checks it. And in fact, it does this a couple of times. It does this little oscillating dance back and forth over the static object. And once it figures out that it's static, that it's not moving, then it knows what it is. It can make the correct identification, and then it can move on. But when it interacts with another user, the user isn't just sitting there static. The user is also oscillating. And what you have is when two users interact, you have this little oscillating dance where the users dance with each other in this little oscillating fashion. And this oscillation indicates to the users that they're interacting with another agent. Notice that this oscillation is also going to be different from the shadow object. Although the shadow object does move like an agent, it doesn't oscillate in response to the stimulation that the other agent is responding to. So the idea here is that there's a unique kind of pattern of behavior that the agents have in this environment. That pattern of behavior is manifest when two agents interact, and that particular kind of interaction, that pattern of interaction, it allows users to uniquely identify other agents in the system.
And it's the fact that other agents are going to interact back, right? Whereas the static things aren't, and that's relevant. I mean, you're creating a really rudimentary communication channel, and the idea is that the other people, you know something about the other agents that are engaged in this task with you, and that they're also trying to identify other agents. And so when things flick by them, they're going to try to track that, or they're going to respond to that in some kind of way. Whereas the things that are just static objects, or even the shadows, which are not static objects, aren't going to have that kind of immediate feedback response. They're gonna play by the implicit rules of the game that have been established by the kind of conjoint tasks that everybody that's participating in this is engaged in, and that's relevant.
Right, and that's also why this paradigm has been so popular recently, is because you actually have this really sort of simple environment where all this really complex social behavior and conventional behavior starts to arise. You see users developing certain kinds of conventions, and in fact, if you tell them different things going into the experiment, different goals for the experiment, if you tell them, for instance, that if you prepare them explicitly by telling them that it's a game and the goal is to cooperate, then they'll develop these patterns faster, and they'll be more accurate in identifying and so on.
That's interesting. Is that a follow-up, or was that in the original study?
So that's the thing that that's how I found this posted in Nature. They talk about conventional behavior, social cognition, arising in the context of specifying the kind of game that's being offered. And the idea here is that what happens is that the users sort of develop their own conventions for how to play that game. So what counts as sufficient amount of crossing to verify, and so on.
But that's only in virtue of the fact that both of them already know that they're operating under the same kind of constraints, right? Or that they're operating under the same goals. That everybody that's participating in this game is either not an agent at all, or is an agent who is after the same kind of thing that they are. So it seems like the more you narrow that sort of thing down, the easier it's going to be for other agents to identify one another. And I mean, so, I wonder how much changes in, I mean, this is something we can talk about later, but I wonder how much changes in, like, the grammatical structure of the original of languages that are being used in the original Turing test, how locked in the grammar rules would change the ability for people to identify legitimate agents from chatbots.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point.
Something to talk about later.
Turing has a long passage in the original article where he actually gives a sample dialogue between a human and a machine, and they talk about, like, poetry and stuff. And I don't think any human
Sonnets,
being sonnets. Yeah, I don't think any human being would recognize that as an instance of human conversation alive today. Maybe very few. But just because
professors.
Yeah, maybe English, and
we don't like
human. Yeah. Okay, so back to the perceptual crossing. Yeah, so there's I think you're right that there's room here to even refine the experiment to make it more minimal. I think there's also room at the other end to blow it up and make it more complicated, have different kinds of agents. I'm not. So this is all sort of really recent literature, and I'm not aware of anyone building artificial agents to interact on the number line, on the virtual line, that can fool agents into believing that they're also agents. In other words, if you can program something to do the right sort of dance when it encounters another agent to be convincingly.
It seems like that would be like much easier than passing the original linguistic Turing test, right? You just need to have it be responsive. It's something that responds to the input that it's getting in a dynamic way, rather than just sitting there or responding in a fairly static way.
Right. So I think the field here that's conducting this kind of research might be assisted by interpreting Turing's test in the interactionist way. So I suspect that they don't appreciate the extent to which Turing is an interactionist here. Let me just give you an example from one of these papers. This is what year is this? 2008. Talking about the perceptual crossing experiment and its relationship to Turing. And they give images like this. I don't know if you can see it, but it says here on the left.
Yeah, that's showing up fine.
Turing-style description. And the idea here is that it's observer relative, so the observer either observes the thing to be autonomous or not, an insect and a robot. And we judge the robot to be autonomous maybe from the observer's point of view, in other words, that it fools us into thinking the robot's autonomous. Whereas that's all the Turing test tells us, but what we really want to know is about genuine autonomy, whether the machine is genuinely intelligent or autonomous. And in this case, the image says that, look, the insect is autonomous, but the robot isn't. And so the idea here is that we've made a mistake in our ascription of autonomy. It's merely fooled us, and the machine isn't really intelligent. And so they offer the perceptual crossing experiment. They talk about the perceptual crossing experiment, and they offer the perceptual crossing experiment as an alternative to the Turing test. And they say part of what's going on in the perceptual crossing experiment is that you have a knowledge of the mechanism that you're interacting with. In particular, you're told in the perceptual crossing experiment that there's static objects, shadow objects, and agents, and so you have some idea that these kinds of objects will interact differently, and it's on the basis of already having that understanding of the mechanism that I make the discrimination.
Wait, so the idea is that in the actual Turing test you don't have that kind of knowledge? That seems crazy. I mean, the whole thing that's based on is that it's a linguistic test, right? I mean, it's something that's playing the right kind of game that's based on a set of linguistic rules that everybody's exposed to from the time when they're very young.
Yeah, that's right. I think the point here is
really strange.
I don't know about the mechanism by which the computer is generating language. So the thing that I'm interacting with is...
Well, but the mechanism doesn't matter. All I care about is what the actual rule following behavior is.
So this is why they're posing this as an alternative to Turing's test, right? So Turing says it doesn't matter what it actually is. All that matters is how we perceive it, right? So it's either if we're fooled, that we might get it wrong, right? The worry here is that we might get it wrong, that the thing might not actually be intelligent. So the response to this is to say that a better way of making the assessment is not just in light of how it appears to you in the Turing test style, but also in light of the mechanisms by which it operates. And the problem with the Turing test is that it masks these mechanisms, right? Like we said, the point of the Turing test is that you aren't prejudiced against the machine. And they say this is a mistake. What you really need to know is the mechanism by which the thing operates. So the fact that we don't know that the computer is generating language on account of... let me step back. There's an example in philosophy, the blockhead example. So one of the standard objections to Turing's test is that you can make a machine that's clearly dumb that can pass the test anyway. For instance, a really complicated jukebox. Say you had a really complicated jukebox that if you just press the things in the right order, it'll produce sentences that are grammatically correct and appear to be responsive to conversation. And maybe it's really hard to build that jukebox, but the mechanism that operates the jukebox is very, very simple. And even if that jukebox convincingly passed the Turing test, there's no reason to ascribe intelligence to it because there's no real intelligence there. It's just it's only as intelligent as a jukebox. So this is the block.
The intuition behind the Chinese room too, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That it matters how the kind of output is being produced.
Right.
We don't just care about the output, we care about what the internal states are that are producing the output and whether or not those states are generating things that we think are like output worthy in some kind of deep sense. I saw, as you were scrolling through that paper, I saw a reference to Searle, and I didn't catch what the year was, so I'm not sure which one that was. But I know there's one in there somewhere, and it seems like probably that what they're talking about is the difference between derived and original intentionality. That would be my guess anyway, that's what they're worried about. Whether or not this is the kind of thing that can produce its own meaning or its own membership to the community as a result of the kinds of things that are going on inside of it, or whether or not that's just the kind of thing that we have to imagine in it in order to bring it into the community in a way that we can work with.
Yeah. So good. So the kind of so this is all. So sorry. The perceptual crossing experiment here, I think, is operating within the standard interpretation of the Turing test, and the upshot here is that the standard interpretation isn't itself enough. It's not just enough that it's convincing behavior because we might be fooled. You need, in addition to that, a mechanism, and this perceptual crossing stuff is a little bit more sympathetic to Turing, so it's not just the right sort of mechanism in the Searle sense that it's original intentionality, but instead it's something like the mechanism has to be the kind of thing that if we know that the machine is operating on the basis of that mechanism, we're more likely to ascribe intelligence to it. For instance, say in 25 years on Kurzweil's date, we have developed computing architecture that's organic, that works sort of like an actual neural net, and it can do a bunch of computations. And that computer, we're all convinced, operates. It's still a digital computer or whatever, but it operates sufficiently mind-like that when it has these conversations, we judge those conversations to be the conversations of an intelligent machine. And part of our judgment here is not just because the behavior itself is convincing enough, but also because we think the mechanism is the right sort of mechanism to produce that behavior. And when you have those two things in conjunction, then you have genuine artificial intelligence. So you need the mechanism and the behavior to get the behavior right. So this is all sort of standard interpretation. It's standard interpretation because it thinks that there's something left once you have the right behavior that's required to count as a genuine mind.
Which surely is right. I mean, that has to be the case. Otherwise, we're just defending the very basic kind of behaviorism, right? It's not just behavior. I mean, if we had a big community of things that passed the right kind of behaviorist checks and that were only interacting with one another, I'm not so sure that it would be right to say that they're intelligent in the way that we want to talk about them as intelligent. I don't know. Maybe you disagree with that.
There's a caveat here, and the caveat is that the kind of behavior, the kind of pattern of behavior, for instance, like language use, you probably not. I mean, the jukebox blockhead thought experiment is probably wrong. That you're probably not going to be able to generate that kind of behavior with such a simple mechanism. It cuts both ways. You're right that not just any mechanism counts, because not just any mechanism is capable of generating the behavior that would satisfy our recognition. But that doesn't mean it has to be any particular mechanism either, because lots of different mechanisms might generate that same behavior. And so this is why it's still a behaviorist position for Turing.
That almost seems question-begging. So it's true that lots of mechanisms might generate that same kind of behavior, but that's I mean, by hypothesis, that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in some sort of deep fact about the mechanism that's generating behavior in the first place. So we might say that there's some sort of relevant similarity between the kinds of mechanisms that are generating behavior in system A and the kind of mechanism that's generating the relevant behavior in system B. So like the difference between like the kind of steam-powered automata that were in like the Garden of Versailles that were able to produce things that might have looked at first glance like they might be intentional behavior versus the kinds of things that are responsive. Right? So like there's some sort of deeper fact about the fact that the mechanism is able to hook up with other kinds of mechanisms or other kinds of systems at a deeper level. That seems different. It's not just the behavior, it's the way that the behavior is related to other sorts of things.
It's the way that the behavior is related to other sorts of things. I mean, that's right.
Potential behavior, maybe?
No, so, I mean, so this is why I want to emphasize that Turing doesn't have the standard view. So all the arguments that you're raising about some deep mechanism that accounts for behavior, my claim here is just that Turing doesn't buy any of that. Turing doesn't think that there are any deep mechanisms underlying our intelligent behavior. He thinks there's only a social recognition, these social conventions, of what we take to be other intelligent things. And on my interpretation, all that matters is whether the thing that you're engaged with is interacting well enough to sustain the activity in which you're engaging it. So, for instance, if I'm playing something chess, I mean, part of the difficulty with Turing's test here is that it's about language use, and language use is one of the most complicated kinds of social engagements there are that have ever existed. And so, talking about that as a simple criteria, as being it's really easy to manage to sustain a conversation. I mean, most human beings can't manage to sustain a conversation for 5 minutes, so like this isn't a very easy thing.
It's hard to talk pretty.
It's hard to talk pretty. So Turing isn't. Yeah, I lost my spot. Let me go back to this slide here because.
I'm sorry.
I was looking at you being surly in the chat.
Yeah.
It's probably
trying to push the scroll line.
Yeah. Somebody has to, I guess. So this is why I want to push the interactionist interpretation in contrast to the standard interpretation. So on my view, Turing doesn't think there's any such thing as a genuine mind that we can be wrong about. Instead, all there is whether or not the machine in question sustains the kind of activity that we would expect of it if we're going to continue interpreting it as being that kind of thing. So for instance, in a conversation, in a natural language conversation, we have certain kinds of conventional expectations about what it takes to sustain a conversation as an intelligent interlocutor. And if the machine can participate in a way that sustains those expectations, then we should consider it intelligent. The claim here is not that speaking in a conversation makes you intelligent, but rather that it's the kind of thing that we recognize and that we recognize of intelligence, and if the machine can do it also, then we should also recognize its intelligence. So on my slide here, on my slideshow here, the recognition of agency involves a sustained dynamical interaction, the little oscillating dance in the perceptual crossing experiment, and the sustained dynamical interaction in the Turing test is supposed to be the conversational language use. The idea here is that intelligence just is sustaining that sustaining a conversation in natural language. Turing isn't committed to this. This is just this is sort of by concession to his opponents. If his opponents think that there's some criteria of intelligence, like using a natural language, like speaking in a conversation, then let's set that as a standard and see if the machine can meet that standard. But we might set any other number of standards. Turing doesn't have any strong feelings about what those standards should be. In fact, in the objections, he considers lots of standards that he obviously doesn't hold. For instance, the argument that in order to be intelligent, you must have a soul. This is the theological objection. Turing's response to the theological objection is not to say that we don't have souls, is not to give any criteria standard by which something does or does not have a soul. but instead to say that, look, if you think souls are important for intelligence, then, if you think souls are important for intelligent machines, then there must be some behavioral criteria by which we can judge the machine to be intelligent. In the case of souls, we judge that all persons were given souls by God, and so Turing says, well, why couldn't God just give the machine a soul also, thereby meeting that same criteria that we're holding everyone else to?
I mean, the fact that it's a behavioral criterion, or that it's, maybe more broadly an empirical criterion, doesn't seem to defeat the kind of substrate-based arguments that we've been talking about so far here. So you might think that it's true that there's a difference between what we're tempted to think about as artificial intelligence and genuine intelligence, but you might think that that's based on what sort of physical substrate those systems are based on, and those are empirical things too, right? I can take apart an artificial intelligence system and see what it's built out of. I can take apart a computer and see that it's just transistors and capacitors and a bunch of wires that are connecting all of that stuff together, and I can take it apart your head and see that it's not that same kind of thing. So why shouldn't we think that that's the sort of thing that's relevant too? I mean, and this isn't like it's not a straightforward argument for basing intelligence in the kind of material. It's not chauvinism. It's not a straightforward argument for basing the kind of material that we have, but we have a immediate example of the kind of thing that's intelligent, and it doesn't seem like, unless we're willing to countenance behavior as the sort of thing that's the right test for intelligence, we should immediately bring in something that looks like it's doing what we do but doesn't build up from the right kind of substrate. Does that make sense? I'm still trying to push a Searle line.
I mean, I don't think it makes sense. I remember where I was, which was to give a non-verbal example of this. I think all the worries from the Searle line about intentionality, or that there's some special mindedness going on, dissolve when we use something other than language. I don't think Turing himself has any special commitment to language as a criteria of intelligence. So I think it's fine to just apply this to other kinds of criteria. The perceptual crossing experiment is a non-verbal kind of Turing test where you're looking for just a kind of behavior, and it's really hard to find intentionality, room for intentional descriptions in this kind of behavior.
At least in a way that's not just a functional description, right?
Especially if it's easy to build a machine that can replicate that behavior. The idea here is that if you can build a machine that reliably engages in this oscillating dance with other agents, such that other agents reliably identify that machine as an agent in the system, then that's all there is to being an agent in the system. In other words, being an agent in this perceptual crossing virtual space just means engaging in this oscillating dance when you encounter another agent. Anything that does that is an agent. Almost by definition, because that's what everyone recognizes as agency. Again, the point here is that there's no deep fact about what counts as an agent. There's just a behavioral fact. Now, it might be that only certain kinds of things can actually engage in that behavior. Not just any rock will be able to do that kind of dance. In fact, it might be really complicated to build. Maybe we're overestimating how simple it is to build a machine that can do this kind of dance. The more complicated our activity is, the more complicated the activity under consideration is, the more difficult it will be to get a machine to do that kind of thing. And it might also be that the more limited number of machines that can actually perform that task, it's logically possible that the only kind of thing that can perform the kind of dances that human beings are capable of are machines that are very, very like us. That's certainly a logical possibility, but there doesn't seem to be very much reason to suspect it, especially because the kinds of behaviors that we engage in are so common across the animal kingdom, even in creatures that don't have things that are remotely physiologically like us. I like the ant example a lot, and ants aren't even chordates. Like we have very they're a very distant relative to us, but we have lots of things in common in terms of our organizational dynamics and patterns of behavior. And it suggests that these patterns of behavior aren't just based on super intelligent brain capacity, but have something more fundamental to do with the way organization happens in nature. If that's the case, then a machine that behaves according to those same dynamics shouldn't be distinguished from the rest of those natural systems. It should be included and described in those same terms. If we're going to describe some particular pattern of behavior as intelligent behavior, then when a machine engages in the dynamics suited to that task, we should consider it intelligent. Let me give one example, non-verbal example that's not a little more complicated than the perceptual crossing experiment, and that's playing chess. A very classic sort of AI example. So playing chess well is an indicator of intelligence. When a human being plays chess well, even if they're crazy in all other respects, we usually consider them intelligent. I was going to say something about Bobby Fischer, but I probably should just keep moving on. Someone who plays chess well, we consider intelligent. And playing chess well means being able to engage in certain kinds of moves, certain kinds of strategies, certain kinds of play styles, being able to beat certain kinds of opponents in a fair game. Not everything can do that. In fact, you have to be a very special kind of machine to be able to do that. And it might be that multiple types of machines, multiple categories of machines actually can do that. So maybe one of those is the kind of pattern matching that human brains do, and maybe another kind is the search tree pruning search that Deep Blue does. I fully grant that these are two different mechanisms, two different algorithms, two different strategies for solving the chess problem. So if we're just looking at indistinguishability, Deep Blue doesn't meet that criteria. Deep Blue doesn't perform like any other chess player. And in fact, the uniqueness and the eccentricities of Deep Blue are part of what its opponents use when it plays Deep Blue. Kasparov knew that Deep Blue has certain kinds of limitations and biases, and it uses those to its advantage, the same way that Kasparov would play to any other opponent's strengths and weaknesses. So the question here about whether it plays well at chess is not a question of what it's made of, but the question is of what kind of behavior it undergoes. So I can also ask if a rock plays chess well. I can set up a chessboard and put the rock on the other side of it, and say go, and put up a timer. But the rock isn't going to respond very well. It doesn't know how to do the dance. It's, for all intents and purposes, a static object. And I might give it the benefit of the doubt for a long time, but eventually I'm going to get bored and realize that it's not really playing chess. I'm going to judge it as not a good chess player. I judge it as not a good chess player not because it's not the right sort of thing, but because it's not doing the right sort of thing. It's not behaving in chess-appropriate ways. But Deep Blue is behaving in chess-appropriate ways. It's generating performances of chess behavior that not only do we recognize as legitimate chess behavior, but we also recognize it as high-level chess behavior that is not only impressive, but meets or exceeds our own best chess players.
Wait. Okay, hold on. I have a couple of things I want to say here.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight two words. You used the word dynamics a second ago, and then you also used the words high level when talking about the Deep Blue example. Both of these, it seems like, have to do with relational kinds of interactive facts, right? It has to do with where something's behavior fits into the overall, into the system in which it's embedded. So if we're going to do some kind of broad Turing test for intelligence by this criterion, then it seems like intelligence is going to be a moving target by the standards of the community in which the system that's being tested by this is embedded. That is, it has to do with the way that whether or not we treat something as intelligent, where we means some kind of community of mutually engaging intelligent agents, where I agree that you're intelligent and you agree that I'm intelligent, and we both agree that this other person is intelligent. And the thing that we're testing is sort of potentially out here, outside the community, and we're judging it by the standards. So to take the chess example, as the game of chess evolves, it seems like something that might have been considered competent or grandmaster chess player, right, is going to change as the community's standards change for this. So that seems a little weird too. No, you don't think so?
No.
I mean, especially if that's extended to intelligent. I mean, that seems like intelligent is going to be a fact that's relative to the sort of thing that's being interacted with. So if I dropped the dumbest cat that we have in our house onto a planet where everything was just that dumb, that cat's going to be counted as intelligent. But if it's the kind of thing that's interacting with the community that it's generally interacting with, if it gets dropped onto a planet with just people, it's going to be counted as not intelligent. And this makes this, I mean, that's not just a behavior then, which is the way you've been describing it so far. It's not a behaviorist thing. It's a relational behaviorist thing, and has to do with how a community is standardizing the sort of thing that's appropriate for ascribing a particular description. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's right. I don't know how that's not behaviorist anymore. There's no so the reason
it's certainly not traditionally behaviorist.
I mean, it depends on which traditional behavior. If you're talking about Turing, I think all of this is packed right into Turing. I think Turing's test is very, very explicitly viewing intelligence through the lens of this interpretive judgment relative to what we consider a competent language user would judge. It's not at all looking for some absolute criteria. It's looking for a relational criteria, relation to a competent judge. I think in the chess example, it's a lot easier to see that. I don't know why we would expect some objective, all things considered, measure of intelligence in the first place. When I say that it's relative, I don't mean that it's just made up or that it's constructed out of nothing. I mean that it's relative to the particular community that it's situated in. So it has to be, you're right, it has to be responsive to that community. I mean, this is why it's the interactionist view. And for Turing, being appropriately interactionist means fitting into that community. Another reason to think that Turing has this view is that he says multiple times in the essay that he thinks that the standards of intelligence will change over time. His prediction in the year 2000 is not just that machines will pass this test, but that it'll be part of common parlance, part of common sense, that machines can think, and that you'll be able to say such things without expecting to be contradicted. I think this indicates very strongly that Turing's not talking about objective, absolute criteria of intelligence or what genuinely counts as a mind, but instead he's talking about our capacity to recognize a member of our community for certain kinds of activities. The most important for him, not for him, but for the people that he's engaging, the most important criteria at the time was language use. If you were part of our linguistic community, you were sort of fully human in a way that other kinds of even intelligent creatures weren't. Maybe dogs and cats are intelligent, but they're not part of the human language community. I think modern views of language have matured a little bit, and I don't think language is first of all, language is extremely diverse, and there's lots of human language users who are isolated from the language. I'm thinking of like the deaf community, for instance, who don't have the same kinds of interactions with my language community. To think that this is a single standard criteria of intelligence, even with language use, I think it doesn't really pass muster anymore. But I think...
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, but I think once we get rid of the verbal stuff, there's lots of cases, there's lots of really important cases where we do want to consider whether or not machines fit into our communities. I think machines fit into our linguistic communities. Since like 2005, I've been arguing that Google is a language user, in just the sense that Google manipulates linguistic tokens in ways that the rest of the linguistic community is sensitive to and has an impact on the way that community uses its language. That doesn't mean that Google's a natural language user, and it doesn't mean that Google passes the Turing test in the sense that we can talk to it in a conversation, but it does mean that Google's use of language is embedded as another agent in the same field of activity that all other linguistic agents are engaged in, and that matters for understanding how our language activity develops over time. It matters, for instance, the meme space only makes sense the conceptual human conceptual space only makes sense when we understand Google's influence on it and the way that Google has manipulated things in that space. For this reason, I want to say Google is a participant in the human language game. I think it's been such a participant for a long time. But I think there are even better and sort of less extreme examples of where this kind of discussion about whether or not the machine counts as a participant in the community is relevant. Back to the driving cars case. It doesn't make any sense anymore to talk about whether something counts as a real driver or an as-if driver. There are just drivers, and some of them are machines, and some of them are human beings. It might be that the machines behave really differently than human beings, such that we can easily distinguish them. It might be that the government in a few years decides that all autonomous vehicles must be stamped with a big letter A to indicate that they're autonomous, and so that we all are afraid of them all the time. In which case, it would be really easy to distinguish the autonomous machines from the human beings. The point isn't whether or not we can distinguish them. The point is, are they participants in the traffic community? Are they participants on the road? Right? So there's this pattern of social behavior called traffic that human beings engage in, and the way that we engage that pattern has consequences for the way the pattern organizes, for where the traffic jams are, for the dispersion of cars, and so on. When you populate that same field with a bunch of autonomous drivers, it's going to have an impact on that traffic. It's going to have an impact on the way the traffic develops, how it behaves in certain conditions, how it behaves under overloaded conditions or in dangerous conditions, and so on. Putting machine participants in that social environment changes its dynamics in a way that's relevant to consider, and asking whether or not it's a genuine driver in these cases doesn't cut any important distinctions in having that conversation. So this is a case where I think Turing's call for fair play is very appropriate. What we want to do when we judge the competency of a driver is by the criteria that we judge all drivers. So is it being safe, and so on. If we hold the machines to some radically different standard, then there has to be some basis for that. It can't just be because it's a machine. There has to be some fair basis for that. So these kinds of activities, so the gaming, the gaming and the driving case are non-verbal cases where the same kind of Turing test will apply, where we're looking for not standards of judgment, but for recognition of participation in community. So this is why this is the participatory interpretation, and hopefully that makes it clear how it's distinct from the standard interpretation.
Let me suggest something. So one of the ways that this seems different is that the fact that this relies partially on community standards means that the evolution of what novel, so think about either the autonomous vehicles or something like machine chess players can do, or things that can pass the traditional Turing test and play the language game. Part of what that means is that their participation in this makes the standards for inclusion in the community different. And that's one of the ways in which this is not just a behaviorist criterion. It's not static, right? No, it's not. It has nothing to do with behavior, or it has something to do with behavior, but behavior is shifting the standards of the community. Whereas if you had just a static kind of behaviorist criteria for intelligence, if whether or not some system could just jump through this set of hoops, that doesn't have anything to do with what the standards of the community are. Something being proficient in chess or something being proficient language user wouldn't have anything to do with what the interactions, what the proficiency of the things that it was interacting with were, with whether or not the things that it was playing the game with what the skill level of the things that it was playing the game with were. And that doesn't seem like what you want to say, right? So, I mean, that's one of the ways in which this is not just a behaviorist criterion.
I mean, I find this all to be things. No, I find this all to be a straw man of behaviorism, though. I think the behaviorists were really sophisticated about, at least some of them were very sophisticated about the role of interpretation in assessing scientific claims. Quine in particular, but Carnap also, they they didn't think that science was making absolute claims in the sense that were independent of any community standards. They thought that scientific claims must always be interpreted in light of the community standards.
But that's not behaviorism, then. I mean, that seems that, if anything, that's closer to functionalism, because it has something to do with discharging a particular role. Yeah, right. That's right. But, in a larger context.
But roles are always characterized in terms of behavior.
Right. That's right. But they're characterized in terms of behavior plus something else.
No, there's no plus anything else. There's just
it's the context.
Behavior. I mean, situated behavior. So, I mean, I don't want to defend the sort of dumb straw man 1950s behaviorism, where, but in the time since then, we've had cognitive science has gotten really sophisticated in talking about situated, embedded, embodied systems that are embedded inside a socially a social environment with normative force that constrains the behavior of that system. That doesn't make it any less a behavioral criteria. In particular, the only all of our judgments are judgments about the behavior of the system in light of the community standards, but it's still, you're not judging anything other than the behavior.
I mean, the fact that the judgments are coming in light of a particular kind of community standards rather than being standardized to some sort of a priori or abstract goal, I think, is significant. I mean, the reason that people are worried about this being, or reason people are worried about the Turing test being like a callback to the 1950s behaviorism is that they think that there's some sort of static test that something has to pass. So, like, 30% or whatever of people have to decide that something is participating in the language game well enough in order for it to count as intelligent. But that's not right. This is something that's evolving. So, like, as we move forward with the kinds of things that are able to pass the language game in particular ways, or that are able to play the language game in particular ways, as we evolve in the rules that we have, maybe chess is a better example, as the standards for community involvement change, then what's going to count as something that's relevantly a participant is certainly also going to have to change, and that's not just behavior. It's behavior plus an interaction.
No, I disagree with this. No, I disagree with this interpretation. I especially disagree. So the reason I want to emphasize the behaviorism here is because it's really important that Turing isn't committed to anything deeper about intelligence, and all of the stuff that I'm arguing is also not committed to anything deeper about what counts as intelligence. You're right that the community standards shift, but I don't know why that.
But that's not behavior.
The community standards are not behavior. That's your point?
Not in any way that's relevantly similar to the kind of behaviorism.
So the kind of responses that Turing's tests get are the following kinds of responses. This doesn't account for consciousness, or this doesn't account for intentionality or self-awareness. And these are anti-behaviorist responses. They're saying that there's some internal process that you can't assess from behavior that matters to the kind of thing it is, whether or not it's intelligent or not, but that we can't see from mere observation. I'm not saying that Turing is committed to anything like that, and so in this sense Turing is a behaviorist because the only standards we have are the standards of our judgment, given our background community standards. Those standards change over time, but it's always from the standards that we're judging behavior, and we're not judging anything apart from behavior. There's no evidence that we have, and if we want evidence of any particular thing, so Turing says over and over again, like, if you want to talk about consciousness, then we have to talk about some behavioral manifestation of consciousness, and that stays the same in my interpretation here. You have to get the machine to do the right sort of thing. It's not just, you have to get the machine to do the right sort of thing. That makes it behaviorist. What counts as the right sort of thing has to appeal to community standards, and maybe there's some versions of behaviorism that thought that community standards were irrelevant, but I don't know what that was.
Well,
I think
okay, so maybe the right way to say it is that there's a difference, like what you're trying to appeal to is like an externalist kind of behaviorism, that where the right behavior is defined by community standards, and the normal interactions that other members of the community, that the putative thing that's being brought in may or may not satisfy. I mean, it seems like regular behaviorism didn't have that sort of nuance built into it.
I think that's just a straw man, but whatever.
No, I don't think that's right. I really don't think that's true. That there was a particular kind of behavior that was being satisfied. I don't think
Turing has that view.
There were people that were arguing that.
I don't think Turing has that view. I don't think Turing thinks that there are...
Fine, that's right. Okay, fine. That's okay. But I mean, part of what I'm trying to do here is to distinguish between what Turing is arguing and what the less sophisticated behaviorists from the 1950s and 1960s were arguing. Turing has a view in which intelligence is an embedded thing. It's something that has to do with whether or not something satisfies the community standards, and so intelligence, as a definition, evolves with community standards. Whether or not something's going to count as intelligence partially is a function of what kind of thing it's dropped into. Behaviorism, the regular behaviorism, old behaviorism, doesn't seem to think that. It has to do with what sort of behaviors it has. And, I mean, behaviors are clearly not externally defined. It just has to do with what it's doing. Something's intelligent just by how it responds to certain stimuli.
I mean, Quine publishes Two Dogmas of Empiricism in the 1950s, which is a standard behaviorist tract, and the whole thing is about the indeterminacy of meaning and how you can't determine those kinds of specific. I mean, the reason I want to defend the behaviorism is because of the anti-behaviorist arguments which are starting to crop up around. Maybe this is a good way to transition into the next section about why Eugene matters. The arguments are starting to crop up that what we really want is this internal thing that science doesn't know how to characterize, and so on. And I want to say that no. In fact, all we need is something that does the right sort of thing. And we all know what that sort of thing is because we're already embedded in these community standards. So maybe this is part of the response, is that you don't need to appeal to the interpretive point if you're already within the community that has bought into that interpretation. Once you're in that community, all that matters is the thing doing the right thing. So if we already have a sense of what counts as good chess playing, then it's merely a matter of behaving the right way for a computer to play good chess.
But what counts as good chess playing is partially a function of what kinds of things what kinds of agents are actually already participants in the community, right? So if I secretly work on an ultra chess playing computer and drop it into the community and it's able to beat all of the grandmasters in the way that Deep Blue did, then what counts as good chess playing by this definition has changed.
Right? And that's in fact
not just behaviorism. That's a much more sophisticated position.
I mean, I think this is the strong behaviorism. But the point is that this is what you actually see. But when you drop the computers into these communities, it does change the standards. So chess, the metagame.
That's right.
Chess
yes. Yeah. That's right.
And same thing with the autonomous cars on the road and so on. Autonomous drones dropping bombs and so on. Okay. So let's go on to Eugene. So Eugene passes the test, and there was some hype around this. The claim was that it was the first thing to pass the test. Well, it was really the first thing to pass a test that was this big, and the point of big here is how many different judges there were and how many different conversations were held. So other machines have passed the test by some criteria, in the sense of convincing 30% of the judges after 5 minutes of conversation. Cleverbot did this back in 2001. A few other machines did this also. Eugene, in fact, did this in 2012 on the centenary of Turing's death, I believe. No, couldn't have been his death. It was some.
He died in 1912.
Yeah. It was not. Yeah.
50 years. Maybe.
50 years. Yeah, maybe. Something like that. It was some Turing event, and Eugene did a Turing demonstration, and it was with 150 judges I'm sorry, 30 judges and 150 conversations, and it passed 29% of the conversations. In 29% of the conversations, it fooled the judges that it was human. That doesn't quite meet the 30% mark, and so this year, 2 years later, they did it again, this time with twice as many conversations, so this time 300 conversations, and Eugene convinced 33%, I believe, which is just over the mark. So the claim is that Turing passed the test. There's been lots of backlash, so I want to deal with some of the kinds of responses that this stunt generated. So one response was showing excerpts of the conversations from Eugene and sort of mocking them, that this doesn't look like a real conversation, complaining that Eugene was posturing as a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy, and therefore it wasn't meeting the standards of a normal conversational a conversation between natural language users.
We've all done that.
Yeah. Good. So a couple of responses here. Yes, I mean, people do talk like Eugene. Some people do have language patterns that are at least similar to Eugene. We've all talked to 13-year-old Ukrainian boys, I think. Maybe not.
No, definitely. All the time.
All the time.
More than one at once.
The number of judges is big, but the judges were also sort of celebrities and so on, and people didn't like that too much either. Didn't think it counts. So one thing to point out really importantly here is that no evidence of a dialogue would ever be enough to undermine the passing of the test. You can't telling the judge that his judgment was wrong is not a proper response to a passed test. Someone might look at the transcript from someone who was convinced that the machine was intelligent and say, oh, I wouldn't have been convinced by that. But that doesn't prove anything at all, because what matters is, was the judge himself or herself engaged in that conversation in a way that sustained the conversation, in a way that sustained the conversation. You want to cut it short? We have been at this an hour and a half.
Yeah, well, I have something to say to that, but yeah, it's 11:30. There's a whole other thing to do here. I mean, we could cut it. I would be willing to cut the video and keep going. It's up to you. Like, do another one?
You mean?
So it's split into two.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So we're gonna. Okay, so let me go back to the thing. We're going to break off.
Brief break.
Yeah, we've talked about how the Turing test works. We're going to come back on why Eugene matters, and discuss the backlash from Kurzweil and Figolucci. Okay.
All right. Do it.
Sorry, I was supposed to share that with you. Okay. So, yeah, we'll take a break, maybe 15 minutes or something. I sort of want to come back and finish this up because. Yeah,
no, let's do it. It's just I think that people are not going to be willing to watch like a 3-hour video.
Yeah, maybe. Okay. All right. We'll be right back.